The spring sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Silver Creek as Beatrice Mills clutched what remained of her dress, trying desperately to hold the fraying seams together while the town's most affluent women circled her like vultures. Their laughter cut through the afternoon air, sharper than any knife she'd ever felt against her skin during her 22 years of hardscrabble living. "Look at her," sneered Vivian Thompson, wife of the bank owner, loud enough for everyone on the boardwalk to hear. "Can't even afford a proper dress. What kind of woman shows up in town looking like she's been dragged behind a stagecoach?" Beatrice kept her eyes fixed on the weathered boardwalk beneath her worn boots. The dress had been her mother's, the last thing she had of the woman who died bringing her into this world. 6 months of working as a laundress after her father's passing had left little money for luxuries like new clothing, especially after paying off his debts. "Maybe she's hoping to catch herself a husband," another woman cackled, "though I can't imagine who'd want damaged goods wrapped in rags." Tears threatened, but Beatrice refused to give them the satisfaction. She'd come to town for supplies, not humiliation. But the cruel words stung nonetheless, especially since she'd spent the last of her coins on flour and coffee rather than fabric for a new dress. From the shade of the livery stable across the street, a tall figure leaned against a post, watching the scene unfold. Preston O'Malley adjusted his worn Stetson, his eyes narrowing beneath the brim. He'd been in Silver Creek just 3 days, long enough to stable his horses, secure a room at the boarding house, and recognize the cruel pecking order that existed in this town, like most others across the frontier. The women's taunts grew louder as they backed Beatrice against the general store wall. Preston had seen enough. He pushed off from the post and crossed the street with long, deliberate strides, spurs jingling with each step. Dust clung to his denim pants, and his shirt bore the stains of hard travel, but there was something in his bearing that made the cackling women pause as he approached. "Ladies," he said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Fine afternoon, wouldn't you say?" Vivian Thompson looked him up and down, taking in his trail-worn appearance with obvious disdain. "And who might you be?" "Preston O'Malley. Just rode in from Tucson." He smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "I couldn't help but notice your passionate discussion about fashion." The women exchanged glances, unsure whether to be flattered or offended by his intrusion. "Well, Mr. O'Malley," Vivian said with a sniff, "we were merely observing that some people ought to have more pride in their appearance before coming to town." Preston nodded thoughtfully. "That's mighty interesting. Where I come from, we judge folks by their character, not their clothing." He turned to Beatrice, whose cheeks had flushed crimson with embarrassment. "Miss, I believe Mr. Johnson over at the general store has some packages waiting to be delivered up to the Bradley Ranch. I was heading that direction myself. Perhaps we could assist each other?" Beatrice looked up, meeting his gaze for the first time. His eyes were a warm hazel, kind but carrying a hardness around the edges that spoke of years on the frontier. She recognized the lifeline he was throwing her. "That would be most appreciated, sir," she managed, her voice soft but steady. The women's mouths hung open as Preston offered Beatrice his arm and escorted her into the general store, leaving them speechless on the boardwalk. Inside the store, the cool air was a blessed relief. Mr. Johnson looked up from his ledger, eyebrows raised in surprise. "I apologize for the fiction," Preston said quietly once the door had closed behind them. "I thought you might appreciate an escape from those harpies." Beatrice nodded, finally releasing the breath she'd been holding. "Thank you, Mr. O'Malley. I'm Beatrice Mills." "Miss Mills." He tipped his hat properly. "A pleasure. Now, is there anything you actually need from the store? I'd be happy to accompany you wherever you're headed afterward." "I've already purchased what I came for," she replied, lifting the small bundle of supplies. "I live just outside town. It's not far, but you'd rather not face that firing squad again," Preston finished for her. "Understandable. My horse is at the livery. Would you allow me to escort you home?" Beatrice hesitated. Her father had taught her to be wary of strangers, especially men offering assistance without obvious motivation. But something in Preston's direct gaze suggested honesty, and after the humiliation she'd just endured, the thought of walking back through town alone was unbearable. "Yes, thank you," she decided. That's very kind. Mr. Johnson watched their exchange with undisguised curiosity. Mr. O'Malley, he called as they turned to leave, you mentioned the Bradley Ranch. You know the Bradleys? Preston smiled easily. Worked there a few seasons back. Thought I might see if they needed an extra hand this year. The storekeeper nodded, apparently satisfied. Good folks, the Bradleys. Tell them Johnson says hello if you see them. Outside, Preston led Beatrice around the back of the store toward the livery, avoiding the main street where the women might still be lingering. His horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding, nickered softly as they approached. This is Thunder, Preston said, patting the horse's neck. He doesn't look like much, but he's got heart. He's beautiful, Beatrice replied, genuinely admiring the animal's strong lines and intelligent eyes. Preston untied Thunder and led him out of the stable. Let me help you up, he offered, cupping his hands to give her a boost. Beatrice glanced down at her tattered dress, acutely aware of how much worse it might look after riding. Perhaps I should walk alongside. Nonsense, Preston said gently. Thunder can carry us both, and it'll get you home quicker. With reluctance, Beatrice placed her foot in his cupped hands and let him boost her onto the saddle. She arranged her skirts as modestly as possible while Preston swung up behind her, keeping a respectful distance despite the confines of the saddle. Just point the way, Miss Mills, he said, reaching around her to take the reins. As they rode out of town, Beatrice felt the weight of stares upon them, not just from the society women, but from everyone they passed. A strange man and a woman in a ragged dress, riding double on a single horse, it was bound to start tongues wagging. Yet somehow, with Preston's solid presence behind her, the stares didn't cut as deeply. May I ask what brings you to Silver Creek, Mr. O'Malley? She asked as the town receded behind them and the trail wound through scrubby desert landscape. Call me Preston, please, he replied, and it's a long story, not particularly interesting. I've been working cattle drives between Texas and Kansas for a few years. Thought I might try settling somewhere for a spell. And you chose Silver Creek? Beatrice couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. The town wasn't known for its opportunities. Preston chuckled, the sound rumbling against her back. It chose me, in a way. My horse threw a shoe about 10 miles out, and this was the nearest place with a blacksmith. Then I heard about possible work at the Bradley place. He paused. What about you? You mentioned you live outside town? Beatrice pointed to a cluster of trees in the distance. Just beyond that cottonwood stand. My father built our cabin near the creek. Your father? He passed 6 months ago. Pneumonia. The words still caught in her throat. It's just me now. Preston was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry for your loss. They rode in companionable silence until the cabin came into view. It was small but solidly built, with a vegetable garden to one side and a modest corral that currently stood empty. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and Beatrice tensed. Something wrong? Preston asked, noticing her reaction. I didn't leave a fire burning, she said, her voice tight with concern. Preston immediately slowed Thunder, approaching more cautiously. Stay here, he said, helping her down before dismounting himself. He untied a rifle from his saddle and checked that it was loaded. No, Beatrice said firmly. This is my home. I'm coming with you. Preston looked like he wanted to argue, but nodded instead. Stay behind me. They approached the cabin together, Preston moving with the quiet assurance of a man accustomed to potential danger. As they neared the door, however, it swung open to reveal a grizzled old man with a shotgun. That's far enough, the man called, training the weapon on them. Mr. Harper, Beatrice exclaimed, stepping out from behind Preston. What are you doing in my house? The old man lowered his shotgun immediately, relief washing over his weathered face. Beatrice, thank the Lord. When I saw your chimney smoking from my place, I feared the worst. Some drifters have been causing trouble in these parts. Preston lowered his rifle as well, though he kept it ready. You know this man, Miss Mills? This is Edwin Harper, my nearest neighbor, Beatrice explained. He lives about a mile west of here. She turned back to the old man. Mr. Harper, this is Preston O'Malley. He was kind enough to escort me home. Harper eyed Preston suspiciously. And why would a stranger be escorting you anywhere, girl? Before Beatrice could respond, Preston stepped forward, extending his hand. Miss Mills was facing some unpleasantness in town. I offered my assistance. The old man hesitated, then grudgingly shook Preston's hand. Well, I suppose I should thank you for that. Those town folks never did treat Beatrice right, even when John was alive. He turned to Beatrice. I came by to drop off some venison. Shot a deer yesterday. Too much for just me. It's in your cold cellar now. That's very kind, Mr. Harper, Beatrice said. Would you both like to come in for coffee? It's the least I can offer. Harper shook his head. Need to get back before dark. But you be careful, girl. Strange men offering help often want something in return. He gave Preston another hard look before limping past them toward a mule tethered nearby. Your neighbor seems protective, Preston observed once Harper had ridden away. Beatrice sighed. He and my father were friends. He's been checking on me since Pa died, though I've told him I can manage. Can you? Preston asked, his gaze taking in the cabin, the empty corral, and the large garden that would soon need tending. That's a lot of work for one person. I've managed so far, Beatrice replied with a lift of her chin. The coffee offer stands, Mr. O'Malley, but then I imagine you'll want to continue to the Bradley Ranch before nightfall. Preston glanced at the sun, which was indeed beginning its descent toward the horizon. I wouldn't say no to coffee before I ride on. Inside, the cabin was neat and modestly furnished. A quilt in faded blues and reds covered a narrow bed in one corner. A table with 2 chairs stood near the hearth, where a small fire burned, warming a pot of something that smelled hearty and inviting. Mr. Harper must have started the stew as well, Beatrice observed, hanging her shawl on a peg by the door. Please sit. Preston removed his hat and took a seat at the table, while Beatrice busied herself with the coffee. He watched her move around the small space, noting how, despite her worn dress, there was a quiet dignity in her bearing. She was pretty, he realized, though not in the showy way of saloon girls or the polished manner of society women. Her brown hair, escaping from its pins, caught glints of copper in the firelight, and her eyes, when they met his, were a clear, steady blue. How long have you lived here? He asked as she placed a steaming cup before him. All my life, Beatrice answered, sitting across from him with her own cup. My father built this place before I was born. My mother died in childbirth, so it was just him and me until... She trailed off, staring into her coffee. Until 6 months ago, Preston finished gently. That's a hard loss, Beatrice nodded. The hardest part is how quickly everything changes. One day you have a place in the world, and the next you're just adrift. She gave a small, self-conscious laugh. I'm sorry. You don't need to hear all this. No apologies needed, Preston said. I understand more than you might think. Lost my own parents when I was 16. Tornado took our farm in Nebraska. Been drifting ever since. A moment of understanding passed between them. A shared recognition of what it meant to be alone in a world that showed little mercy to those without connections or means. What will you do now? Beatrice asked. Besides looking for work at the Bradley place? Preston shrugged, sipping his coffee. Hadn't thought much beyond that. Find steady work, save some money, maybe stake a claim somewhere eventually. Well, I hope you find what you're looking for, Beatrice said sincerely. Preston studied her face. And what about you? What are your plans? Beatrice glanced around the cabin, her expression a mixture of determination and uncertainty. Keep going, I suppose. The garden will yield enough to sell some vegetables in town. I take in laundry when I can get it. It's not much, but it's a living. Preston nodded, though his eyes lingered on her tattered dress and the worn floorboards beneath their feet. A living, perhaps, but a precarious one. All too soon, the coffee was finished, and the lengthening shadows outside reminded Preston that he needed to move on. Thank you for the coffee, Miss Mills, he said, rising and placing his hat back on his head. And for the company. Thank you for your kindness in town, she replied, walking him to the door. It's not often that strangers step in when it would be easier to look away. At the door, Preston paused, seemingly wrestling with a thought. Miss Mills, Beatrice, would it be too forward if I called on you again? Perhaps on my return from the Bradley Ranch? The question caught her off guard. Men didn't call on women like her, women with no family, no prospects, and dresses that were falling apart at the seams. "Why would you want to?" she asked bluntly. Preston smiled, genuine warmth reaching his eyes this time. "Because in a place where women mock others for their clothing and men probably judge you for living alone. I suspect you're the most honest person in the county. That's rare enough to be worth knowing better." Beatrice felt heat rise to her cheeks. Yes? You may call again, Mr. O'Malley." "Preston," he reminded her, his smile widening. "I'll see you soon, Beatrice Mills." As she watched him ride away, the setting sun casting his silhouette in gold and shadow, Beatrice realized her heart was beating faster than it had in months. She told herself it was merely the novelty of conversation with someone who wasn't Mr. Harper or the disapproving townspeople. Nothing more. But as she turned back to her empty cabin, she couldn't quite convince herself that was true. True to his word, Preston returned 3 days later. Beatrice was in the garden, battling the ever-encroaching weeds, when the sound of hoofbeats made her look up. Thunder's distinctive golden coat gleamed in the morning sun as horse and rider approached at an easy lope. Beatrice quickly brushed soil from her hands and straightened her apron. It was her work dress today, nearly as worn as the one she'd worn to town, but at least it wasn't falling apart at the seams. "Good morning," Preston called, dismounting smoothly. He looked different somehow, his face freshly shaved, his shirt clean and pressed, his boots polished to a shine. "Good morning," Beatrice replied, suddenly self-conscious about her dirt-streaked apron and loose hair. "I see you found the Bradley Ranch." "I did," Preston confirmed, leading Thunder toward the cabin. "And found work, too. They need help with the spring roundup and branding." "That's wonderful news," Beatrice said, genuinely pleased for him. Preston nodded, reaching into his saddlebag. "I brought something for you. A thank you for the coffee and conversation." Before Beatrice could protest, he pulled out a package wrapped in brown paper and string. "It's nothing grand," he added quickly, noting her hesitation, "but I thought you might find it useful." Curious despite herself, Beatrice accepted the package and carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a length of calico fabric in a soft blue pattern, along with a spool of matching thread and a packet of needles. "Mr. O'Malley, Preston." "I can't accept this," she said, though her fingers lingered on the lovely fabric. "Sure you can," he replied easily. "Consider it payment for future cups of coffee. I'll be riding back and forth between town and the ranch regularly, and this place is right on my route." Beatrice looked up at him, searching his face for any hint of mockery or ulterior motive. She found only that same direct gaze that had first caught her attention in town. "That's very thoughtful," she finally said. "Thank you." Preston smiled, clearly relieved she'd accepted. "The ranch cook packed me some biscuits this morning, far more than I can eat alone. Would you care to join me for breakfast?" Beatrice glanced at her half-weeded garden, then back at Preston. The garden had waited this long, it could wait a little longer. "I'd like that," she decided. "Let me just wash up." They sat together on the small porch, sharing biscuits still warm from the Bradley Ranch kitchen. Preston told her about the ranch, the vast herds of cattle, the bunkhouse where he now slept alongside 5 other cowboys, the gruff but fair ranch owner, Matthew Bradley. "He's looking for a cook," Preston mentioned between bites. "The last one quit to go back east, and Mrs. Bradley's running herself ragged trying to keep the house and feed all the hands." Beatrice nodded politely, though she couldn't see how this concerned her. "I hope they find someone suitable." Preston glanced at her sideways. "I may have mentioned that I knew someone who might be interested." Beatrice nearly choked on her biscuit. "You didn't." "I did," Preston admitted, looking slightly abashed. "I know it was presumptuous, but you mentioned taking in laundry for income, and cooking for the ranch would pay much better. Plus, there's a small cabin for the cook, meals included." "Preston," Beatrice said, setting her biscuit down, "I appreciate the thought, truly I do, but I can't leave this place. It's all I have left of my father." Preston's expression softened. "I understand. I shouldn't have spoken for you." I just thought—" He trailed off, looking out across her modest property. "What?" Beatrice prompted. "I thought you deserved better than scraping by alone, being mocked by those town women whenever you need supplies." His honesty was disarming. Beatrice was quiet for a long moment. "This land is mine. The cabin, too. If I leave, I have nothing to come back to." "No one's saying you'd have to sell," Preston pointed out. "You could keep the place, earn some money at the ranch, then decide what you want to do. The cook's position wouldn't be forever, just until you're on your feet." The idea settled in Beatrice's mind, taking root despite her initial resistance. A steady income, regular meals, perhaps even enough saved to repair the cabin properly and buy seeds for next season's garden. "I'll think about it," she finally said. Preston nodded, clearly knowing better than to push further. "That's fair. Now, tell me about this garden of yours. What are you growing?" The conversation shifted to safer ground tomatoes and beans, the stubborn prairie soil, the challenge of keeping rabbits out of the lettuce. By the time Preston needed to leave, Beatrice found herself reluctant to see him go. "I'll be back in town day after tomorrow," he said as he mounted Thunder. "If you're interested in at least speaking to Mrs. Bradley about the position, I could escort you to the ranch." Beatrice nodded. "I'll let you know. Thank you again for the fabric." "My pleasure, Miss Mills," Preston replied with a tip of his hat, the formality at odds with the warmth in his eyes. "Until next time." As Thunder carried him away, Beatrice clutched the package of fabric to her chest, her mind whirling with possibilities she hadn't considered in months. Not just about a potential job, but about a handsome cowboy who seemed to see value in her when everyone else saw only poverty. That evening, by lamplight, Beatrice spread the calico fabric across her small table. It was good quality, not fancy, but sturdy and pretty, with a pattern of tiny blue flowers on a cream background. She measured carefully, determined to make the most of Preston's gift. With her limited sewing skills, she could fashion a serviceable dress that wouldn't draw the cruel comments she'd endured before. As she worked, she found herself humming softly a habit she'd abandoned after her father's death, when the silence of the cabin had become too oppressive for music. The simple act of creation, of making something new from Preston's thoughtful gift, lightened her spirit in a way she hadn't expected. 2 days later, Beatrice stood outside the general store in Silver Creek, wearing her new blue calico dress. It wasn't perfect, the seams weren't as straight as a professional seamstress would manage, and she'd had to piece together the bodice carefully to make the fabric stretch, but it was clean, neat, and whole. More importantly, it made her feel like herself again, not a girl to be pitied or mocked. Preston spotted her immediately as he rode into town, his face lighting up in a way that sent an unfamiliar flutter through Beatrice's chest. "Miss Mills," he greeted her, dismounting quickly. "You look lovely." Beatrice smoothed the skirt of her new dress self-consciously. "Thank you." The fabric was perfect. Preston's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than strictly proper, genuine appreciation evident in his gaze. "Does this mean you've decided to speak with Mrs. Bradley?" Beatrice nodded. "I have. If the offer still stands, I'd like to at least hear what the position entails." "Wonderful." Preston's enthusiasm was infectious. "I need to pick up a few supplies for the ranch, then we can head out. Have you eaten? We could get something at the cafe before we leave." The thought of sitting in the town cafe, where she'd surely encounter some of the women who had mocked her, made Beatrice hesitate. But then she straightened her shoulders, bolstered by her new dress and Preston's steadying presence. "Yes, I'd like that," she decided. The cafe was busy with the midday crowd when they entered. Conversation momentarily lulled as heads turned to observe the newcomers. Beatrice felt the weight of stares, including, she noted with an inward grimace, those of Vivian Thompson and her friends seated by the window. Preston, seemingly oblivious to the attention, guided Beatrice to a small table near the back. "The stew here is decent," he said, pulling out her chair. "Not as good as what I imagined you'd make, but filling nonetheless." His casual confidence was a balm to Beatrice's nerves. She sat, arranging her skirts and keeping her eyes fixed on Preston rather than the curious onlookers. They had just placed their order when Vivian Thompson approached their table, her silk dress rustling importantly with each step. Mr. O'Malley, wasn't it? She said, ignoring Beatrice entirely. I don't believe we were properly introduced the other day. Preston rose, his manners impeccable despite the tension Beatrice could see in his jaw. Mrs. Thompson, I remember you quite clearly. I understand you're working at the Bradley Ranch now, Vivian continued, her smile practiced and cold. My husband does business with Matthew Bradley. Perhaps you'll attend the town social this Saturday. It would be an opportunity to meet more suitable acquaintances in Silver Creek. Her gaze flickered dismissively over Beatrice. Before Preston could respond, Beatrice found her voice. Mrs. Thompson, I believe your friends are trying to get your attention. Vivian turned, surprised to be addressed directly by someone she considered so beneath her. Indeed, her companions at the window table were watching the exchange with avid interest. Your new dress is certainly an improvement, Vivian said with a thin smile. Though I can't imagine where you found such quaint fabric. I gave it to her, Preston said, his voice carrying just enough for nearby tables to hear. I thought the color would bring out the blue of her eyes. Don't you agree it suits her beautifully? Vivian's smile froze, her eyes darting between them as she processed this public acknowledgement. Well, she managed finally. How thoughtful of you, Mr. O'Malley. It was the least I could do, Preston continued pleasantly, after Miss Mills was kind enough to share her excellent coffee with me. In fact, she may soon be cooking for the entire Bradley Ranch. Mrs. Bradley is quite eager to meet her. This information that the socially significant Mrs. Bradley was not only willing to meet Beatrice Mills, but potentially employ her visibly rattled Vivian Thompson. Her carefully constructed social hierarchy suddenly seemed less stable. Is that so? Vivian's voice had lost some of its edge. Well, I wish you luck, Miss Mills. The Bradley Ranch is an important part of our community. With a stiff nod, she retreated to her own table, where her friends immediately huddled close for a whispered conference. That was masterfully done, Beatrice said quietly once Vivian was out of earshot. Preston sat back down, a satisfied gleam in his eye. I merely stated facts, though I might have enjoyed it more than strictly necessary. Their stew arrived, steam rising invitingly from the bowls. As they ate, Beatrice noticed that the stares directed their way had changed in quality. There was still curiosity, but now mingled with reassessment, particularly from the women who had witnessed Vivian Thompson's retreat. I think you've just elevated my social standing considerably, Beatrice observed wryly. Preston chuckled. Social standing in a place like Silver Creek isn't worth the dust on your boots. It's what you do and who you are that matters. Is that why you stepped in that day? Beatrice asked, the question that had lingered in her mind finally finding voice. Because of who I am. You didn't even know me. Preston set down his spoon, his expression turning serious. I stepped in because I've seen too many good people beaten down by those who think fine clothes and money make them better than others. My mother used to say that true character shows in how you treat those who can do nothing for you in return. He smiled slightly. Though, as it turns out, you've already given me excellent coffee and conversation, so I'd say I've benefited from our acquaintance. Beatrice felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the hot stew. There was something so refreshingly direct about Preston O'Malley, no games, no hidden agendas, just honest words and actions. Well, I hope Mrs. Bradley finds me suitable, she said, returning to her meal. Otherwise, this trip will have been for nothing except stirring up town gossip. Not for nothing, Preston replied with a smile. I got to see you in that blue dress. That alone was worth the ride to town. The compliment, delivered so simply, brought color to Beatrice's cheeks, and she ducked her head to hide her pleased smile. After their meal, they set out for the Bradley Ranch, Beatrice riding behind Preston on Thunder. The gelding seemed unbothered by the additional weight, maintaining a steady pace as they left Silver Creek behind. The landscape opened up as they rode, transitioning from scrubby desert to rolling grassland dotted with cattle. In the distance, mountains rose against the clear blue sky, their peaks still capped with snow despite the late spring warmth. It's beautiful out here, Beatrice observed, allowing herself to enjoy the sensation of riding with Preston, the solid warmth of him, a contrast to the gentle breeze that played with loose strands of her hair. "It is," Preston agreed. "Different from Nebraska, where I grew up, but beautiful in its own way. The first time I saw those mountains, I knew I wanted to stay in this territory." "Is that why you came back after the cattle drives? For the mountains?" Preston was quiet for a moment. "Partly, and partly because a man gets tired of always moving on. At some point, you want to see the same sun rise over the same hills more than once." Beatrice understood that feeling all too well. "I've never been anywhere else," she admitted. "Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to see different places, but then I think about leaving my father's land." "Maybe someday you'll be able to travel and come back," Preston suggested. "See other places without having to choose one over the other." The idea was appealing, a middle path Beatrice hadn't considered before. "Maybe," she agreed softly. They crested a rise, and suddenly the Bradley Ranch spread out before them, a sprawling main house with several outbuildings, corrals full of horses, and a bunkhouse set a respectful distance from the main residence. Men on horseback moved among herds of cattle in the distance, while closer to the house, a woman hung laundry on a line, her movements quick and efficient despite the large basket at her feet. "That's Mrs. Bradley," Preston said, nodding toward the woman. "She runs the household with the same precision her husband runs the cattle operation." As they approached, Mrs. Bradley looked up, shading her eyes against the sun. She was a handsome woman in her 40s, her dark hair streaked with silver and pulled back in a no-nonsense bun. Despite the domestic task she was performing, she carried herself with the authority of someone used to giving orders and having them obeyed. "O'Malley," she called as they rode into the yard. "Matthew was looking for you this morning." "Yes, madam," Preston replied, dismounting smoothly before helping Beatrice down. "I told the foreman I was heading to town for supplies. I've brought someone I'd like you to meet." Mrs. Bradley approached, her keen eyes taking in Beatrice's neat appearance and straight posture. "You must be Miss Mills. Preston mentioned you might be interested in the cook position." "Yes, madam," Beatrice said, extending her hand. "Beatrice Mills. Thank you for considering me." Mrs. Bradley's handshake was firm. "Preston speaks highly of your cooking, though I gather he's only had your coffee." "My father always said I had a knack for making something from nothing," Beatrice replied honestly. "I've been cooking since I was tall enough to reach the stove." Mrs. Bradley nodded approvingly. "That's the kind of experience that matters on a ranch. Can you cook for large groups? We have 12 hands during normal operations, more during roundup and branding." "I've never cooked for quite that many," Beatrice admitted, "but I'm a quick learner, and I understand hungry men don't need fancy food, just plenty of it that sticks to their ribs." This drew a genuine smile from Mrs. Bradley. "You understand correctly. Come inside and we'll discuss particulars. Preston, Matthew's with the men in the north pasture. You'd best get out there." Preston tipped his hat. "Yes, madam. I'll see you later, Miss Mills." As he rode away, Beatrice felt a momentary pang of nervousness at being left alone, but she squared her shoulders and followed Mrs. Bradley toward the main house. This was an opportunity, perhaps her only one, to secure a future that didn't involve slowly watching her father's homestead crumble around her while she took in other people's laundry. The ranch kitchen was large and well-appointed, with a massive cast-iron stove, ample work surfaces, and shelves stocked with more provisions than Beatrice had seen in one place since before her father's illness. Mrs. Bradley gestured for her to sit at a scrubbed wooden table large enough to seat the entire household. "The position pays $15 a month plus room and board," Mrs. Bradley explained, pouring coffee for both of them. "You'd have Sundays off unless we have guests or it's a special occasion. The cook's cabin is small but private just behind the main house. The previous cook left it clean, though it could use a woman's touch." $15 a month was more than Beatrice could hope to make taking in laundry for a year. She tried to keep her expression neutral, not wanting to appear too eager. "What would my duties include exactly?" she asked. 3 meals a day for the hands," Mrs. Bradley replied. "Breakfast before sunrise, dinner at noon, supper after the day's work. You'd also bake bread and prepare desserts when needed. The men take turns helping with dishes and hauling water. I manage the main house cooking myself, but occasionally we'd need your help for larger gatherings. It sounded like hard work, but honest work, the kind Beatrice was used to. And I would live here on the ranch? Mrs. Bradley nodded. In the cook's cabin, it's expected you'd keep regular hours and maintain proper behavior. Matthew and I run a respectable operation. Of course, Beatrice said quickly. I was raised to value hard work and propriety, Mrs. Bradley. The older woman studied her thoughtfully. Preston mentioned your father passed recently. I'm sorry for your loss. He also mentioned you have property of your own. Yes, madam. A small homestead about an hour's ride from town. It was my father's. And you'd be leaving it to come here? Beatrice hesitated. I hadn't decided whether to sell or try to maintain it somehow. Mrs. Bradley's expression softened slightly. Family land is precious. If you take this position, perhaps one of our hands could ride out occasionally to check on your place, especially during the winter months when work is slower here. The unexpected kindness brought a lump to Beatrice's throat. That would be very generous. Not at all, Mrs. Bradley said practically. Good cooks are hard to find in this territory. If looking after your property occasionally keeps you here and cooking for my husband's ranch hands, it's a fair exchange. She took a sip of her coffee. When could you start? The directness of the question caught Beatrice off guard. You're offering me the position without testing my cooking? Mrs. Bradley smiled. I've been running this ranch alongside my husband for 20 years, Miss Mills. I've learned to trust my judgment of character. You have honest eyes and capable hands. The rest can be learned. She paused. And frankly, I'm tired of trying to manage the house and feed a dozen cowboys. I need help sooner rather than later. Beatrice felt a surge of confidence at the older woman's straightforward assessment. In that case, I could return in 3 days with my belongings. I'll need to make arrangements for my property and pack my things. 3 days it is, Mrs. Bradley agreed, extending her hand to seal their arrangement. Welcome to the Bradley Ranch, Miss Mills. As they shook hands, Beatrice felt a curious mixture of emotions: excitement for this new opportunity, anxiety about leaving her father's homestead, and, threading through it all, a warm anticipation at the thought of seeing Preston O'Malley every day. The tour of the cook's cabin confirmed Mrs. Bradley's description. It was indeed small, just one room with a bed, table, chair, and small stove, but it was clean and solid, with a window that looked out toward the distant mountains. It would be a far cry from the isolation of her father's homestead, surrounded as it was by the bustle of ranch life. By the time Preston returned from the north pasture, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the ranch yard. Beatrice was waiting on the porch of the main house, watching the golden light play across the landscape. There you are, Preston said, dismounting and leading a tired-looking Thunder toward her. I was beginning to think Mrs. Bradley had put you straight to work and I'd missed saying goodbye. Not quite yet, Beatrice replied with a smile, though I do start in 3 days. Preston's face lit up. You got the position? That's wonderful news. Mrs. Bradley was very kind, Beatrice said. She even offered to have someone check on my father's property occasionally. I might have suggested that, Preston admitted, leading Thunder to the water trough. I knew leaving your land would be the hardest part of accepting a position here. Beatrice followed him, touched by his thoughtfulness. Thank you. It does make the decision easier. Preston let Thunder drink his fill before continuing. I should get you back before dark. Did Mrs. Bradley show you the cook's cabin? She did. It's small but comfortable, more than adequate for one person. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Bradley emerged from the house with a package wrapped in brown paper. Some coffee and sugar for your pantry, Miss Mills, she said, handing it to Beatrice. Consider it in advance on your first month's wages. Thank you, Mrs. Bradley, Beatrice said, genuinely moved by the gesture. I'll see you in 3 days. The ride back to Beatrice's homestead was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts as twilight deepened around them. The first stars were appearing in the eastern sky by the time Thunder carried them up to the cabin door. Would you like to come in? Beatrice asked as Preston helped her down. I could make us some coffee with Mrs. Bradley's generous advance. I'd like that, Preston replied, tethering Thunder to the porch rail. Inside, Beatrice lit the lamp and stoked the banked fire in the hearth, while Preston settled at the table. The familiar ritual of making coffee gave her hands something to do while her mind tried to process the day's events. "I can hardly believe how much has changed in just a few days," she said as she placed the coffee pot on the fire to boil. "Are you having second thoughts?" Preston asked, watching her closely. Beatrice shook her head. "Not second thoughts exactly. It's a big change. This place has been my whole world for 22 years. It still can be," Preston pointed out. "You're not selling it. You can visit whenever you want." "I know." Beatrice measured coffee grounds into cups. "And $15 a month is more than I ever hoped to earn. In a year, I could save enough to make real improvements here, maybe even buy a horse of my own." "Then why do you look worried?" Beatrice paused, considering how to express the jumble of emotions she was feeling. "I suppose I'm wondering if I'm betraying my father's memory by leaving, even temporarily. He worked so hard to build this place, to make it a home for us." Preston was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "What would your father want for you, Beatrice? To struggle alone out here, or to have opportunities for a better life?" The question struck her to the core. Her father had always encouraged her independence, her education, her dreams. Even in his final days, he'd worried more about her future than his own comfort. "He'd want me to be secure," she admitted softly, "to have more than just survival." "Then maybe this isn't betraying his memory," Preston suggested gently. "Maybe it's honoring it by making the most of the opportunities that come your way." Beatrice poured the now boiling water over the coffee grounds, letting the rich aroma fill the small cabin. "When did you get so wise, Preston O'Malley?" He chuckled. "Not wisdom, just the perspective of someone who's had to start over a few times. Each ending can be the beginning of something better, if you let it." They sipped their coffee in companionable silence for a while, the lamp casting warm light across the table between them. Outside, the night creatures began their chorus, coyotes in the distance, crickets closer at hand. "Will you help me pack my things?" Beatrice asked eventually. "There's not much, but some of it is heavy for me to manage alone." "Of course," Preston agreed readily. "I can come day after tomorrow with a wagon from the ranch. Matthew won't mind when I explain what it's for." "Thank you." Beatrice hesitated, then added, "For everything. The fabric, the job opportunity, your kindness. I don't know why you've gone to such trouble for someone you barely know." Preston's eyes met hers across the table, serious and sincere. "Maybe I'd like the chance to know you better, if that's something you might want too." The directness of his statement sent a flutter through Beatrice's chest. No man had ever expressed interest in her so plainly before, certainly not one as handsome and capable as Preston O'Malley. "I think I would like that," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Preston's smile was slow and warm, reaching all the way to his eyes. "Good. Then this is just the beginning, Beatrice Mills." As he rode away later that evening, promising to return with the wagon in 2 days' time, Beatrice stood on her porch watching until horse and rider disappeared into the darkness. For the first time since her father's death, the future seemed to hold more promise than dread, more possibility than loss. And if part of that future involved a certain cowboy with kind eyes and a direct manner, well, that was a possibility worth exploring too. True to his word, Preston returned 2 days later with a wagon borrowed from the Bradley Ranch. Beatrice had spent the intervening time sorting through her possessions, deciding what to take to the cook's cabin and what could remain at the homestead. It was a process both practical and emotional, each object carrying memories of her life with her father. The small trunk of her mother's, things a hairbrush with a few strands of copper-brown hair still caught in the bristles, a faded daguerreotype in a tarnished silver frame, a pair of delicate lace gloves never worn in the rough frontier life that had claimed her, would go with Beatrice. So would her father's Bible, the quilt her grandmother had made, and the few books that had formed her education in this isolated place. When Preston arrived, driving a team of sturdy draft horses, Beatrice was ready. Her meager possessions were packed and waiting, the cabin cleaned one final time, the garden weeded and watered in the hope it would survive her occasional visits to tend it. "You've been busy," Preston observed as he helped load her trunk and boxes into the wagon. "There was much to do," Beatrice replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. Leaving, even temporarily, was harder than she'd anticipated. Preston seemed to sense her emotional turmoil. He worked quietly, efficiently, giving her space to process her feelings while ensuring everything was properly secured for the journey. When the last box was loaded, Beatrice stood in the doorway of the cabin, looking around the small space that had been her entire world for so long. The empty hearth, the bare table, the neatly made bed, it looked as though her father might walk in at any moment, stamping dust from his boots and calling her name. "We can wait a bit longer if you need more time," Preston said gently from behind her. Beatrice shook her head. "No, it's time to go." She closed the door firmly and turned toward the future, symbolized by the waiting wagon and the man beside it. The ride to the Bradley Ranch was long but not unpleasant. Preston was an attentive companion, sharing stories of his travels that drew Beatrice out of her melancholy and into occasional laughter. By the time they arrived at the ranch, the sun was high overhead, and Beatrice felt a tentative excitement replacing her earlier sadness. Mrs. Bradley was waiting, directing 2 ranch hands to help unload Beatrice's belongings and carry them to the cook's cabin. "I've had the girls give it a thorough cleaning," she told Beatrice. "There are fresh linens on the bed and firewood stacked by the stove. Once you're settled, come to the main house for dinner. Tomorrow you can familiarize yourself with the kitchen and supplies before taking over the cooking duties." The kindness and practical assistance helped ease Beatrice's transition. As she arranged her few possessions in the cabin, transforming the impersonal space into something that felt, if not like home, at least like her own, she began to see possibilities in this new chapter of her life. A soft knock at the open door drew her attention. Preston stood there, hat in hand, looking slightly uncertain a change from his usual confidence. "Is everything to your satisfaction?" he asked, gesturing around the cabin. "It's lovely," Beatrice assured him. "Mrs. Bradley has been very thoughtful." Preston nodded, seeming relieved. "The hands are looking forward to having a proper cook again. They've been surviving on Mrs. Bradley's cooking and whatever the more skilled among us could manage," he grinned, "which isn't much beyond beans and bacon." Beatrice laughed, placing her mother's hairbrush on the small table by the bed. "Well, I hope I don't disappoint them." "You couldn't," Preston said with such conviction that Beatrice felt warmth spread through her chest. A moment of comfortable silence stretched between them before Preston cleared his throat. "I should let you finish settling in. Mrs. Bradley mentioned dinner at the main house?" "Yes, at 6 o'clock. Would you allow me to escort you?" The formality of his request, coupled with the earnest look in his eyes, made Beatrice's heart beat a little faster. "I'd like that," she replied simply. Preston smiled, settling his hat back on his head. "Until then, Miss Mills." As he walked away, Beatrice found herself watching his retreating figure with a sense of anticipation that had nothing to do with her new position at the ranch and everything to do with the man himself. Dinner at the main house that evening was a more formal affair than Beatrice had expected. Matthew Bradley, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and shrewd eyes, welcomed her warmly, shaking her hand with a grip that spoke of years wrangling cattle and managing men. "Mrs. Bradley tells me you're going to save us all from starvation," he said good-naturedly, "and none too soon. Another week of my wife's biscuits might have caused a rebellion." "Matthew!" Mrs. Bradley swatted her husband's arm, though her eyes twinkled with amusement. "Don't listen to him, Miss Mills. He's been complaining about my cooking for 20 years, yet somehow he's survived." "Only because your other qualities make up for your culinary shortcomings, my dear," Matthew replied, pressing a kiss to his wife's temple with an easy affection that spoke of decades of partnership. Preston, seated across from Beatrice at the large dining table, caught her eye with a small smile. There was something reassuring about his presence, a silent support that helped ease her nervousness in these new surroundings. The conversation flowed easily through dinner, covering everything from the spring roundup to local news to gentle inquiries about Beatrice's background. The Bradleys were clearly sizing her up, but their questions were kind rather than intrusive. "Preston tells us you've managed your father's homestead alone these past months," Matthew said as they enjoyed apple pie for dessert. "That's no small feat for anyone, let alone a young woman." "My father taught me well," Beatrice replied, "though I admit it's been challenging at times." "Beatrice is being modest," Preston interjected. "Her garden is thriving, and she's kept the place in better repair than most men could manage alone." The pride in his voice brought color to Beatrice's cheeks. "You exaggerate, Preston." "I don't believe he does," Mrs. Bradley observed, her keen eyes moving between the two of them. "Self-sufficiency is a valuable quality on the frontier, Miss Mills, as is recognizing when to accept help." The conversation shifted to the next day's duties, but Beatrice caught Mrs. Bradley watching her and Preston with a thoughtful expression that suggested she was seeing more than just a new employee and one of her ranch hands. After dinner, Preston walked Beatrice back to her cabin. The night was clear, stars scattered across the velvet sky like diamonds on black cloth. The ranch was settling into evening quiet, though lanterns still glowed in the bunkhouse windows where off-duty hands played cards or wrote letters home. "The Bradleys seem like good people," Beatrice observed as they walked the short path to the cook's cabin. "They are," Preston agreed, "fair employers and decent folk. They treat their hands well, which is more than can be said for some ranchers in these parts." They reached the cabin door too quickly for Beatrice's liking. The evening had been pleasant, and she found herself reluctant for it to end. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" she asked impulsively. "I noticed Mrs. Bradley stocked my pantry quite generously." Preston hesitated, glancing toward the main house. "I'd like to, but perhaps it would be better if I didn't. Not on your first night here." Beatrice understood immediately. "Of course. Appearances matter." "Unfortunately, they do," Preston said, genuine regret in his voice. "Especially for a woman in your position. I wouldn't want to cause gossip that might make things difficult for you." His consideration touched her. Most men wouldn't think twice about how their actions might affect a woman's reputation or standing. "Thank you for understanding," Beatrice said softly, "and for everything else today." Preston stepped closer, just enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool night air. "Beatrice," he said, his voice low and serious, "I want you to know that my interest in helping you isn't, that is, I hope you don't feel any obligation toward me because of it." Beatrice met his gaze steadily. "I don't feel obligated, Preston. I feel grateful, yes, but also," she searched for the right words, "I enjoy your company. Very much." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "I enjoy yours too, more than I expected to when I stepped into that confrontation in town." For a moment, they stood in silence, the air between them charged with unspoken possibilities. Then, Preston took a small step back, breaking the spell. "I should let you rest," he said. "Tomorrow will be a busy day for you." "Yes," Beatrice agreed, though she made no move to enter her cabin. "Preston?" "Yes?" "I'm glad you were the one who saw me that day in town. I'm glad it was you who helped me." Preston's expression softened. "So am I, Beatrice. More than I can say." He tipped his hat. "Good night." "Good night," she replied, watching as he walked toward the bunkhouse, his figure silhouetted against the starlit sky. Only when he disappeared from view did she enter her cabin, closing the door on one day and opening it to the promise of many more to come. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the early summer sun already warming the air as Beatrice made her way to the main house kitchen. Mrs. Bradley was waiting, coffee pot in hand and a practical apron already tied over her dress. "Good morning, Miss Mills," she greeted Beatrice. "I trust you slept well." "Very well, thank you," Beatrice replied truthfully. The small cabin had been comfortable, and exhaustion from the day's emotions and activities had ensured deep sleep. "Excellent. Today you'll observe and assist while I prepare meals. Tomorrow the kitchen will be yours." Mrs. Bradley handed Beatrice an apron. We serve breakfast at 5:30, dinner at noon, and supper at 6. The men work hard and eat accordingly. The day proved to be an education. Mrs. Bradley was an efficient teacher, showing Beatrice the organization of the large kitchen, the storage pantries filled with flour, sugar, beans, and preserved goods, the root cellar stocked with potatoes and winter vegetables, and the smokehouse where hams and bacon hung in fragrant rows. "We butcher our own meat as needed," Mrs. Bradley explained. "One of the hands will help you with the heavier tasks. Just let the foreman know what you require." By mid-afternoon, Beatrice's head was spinning with information, but she felt confident in her ability to manage the cooking duties. The men had devoured the midday meal with enthusiasm and compliments, many of them introducing themselves to Beatrice with shy nods or awkward handshakes. Preston had been among them, but he'd kept a respectful distance, joining the other hands at their table rather than singling Beatrice out for attention. She appreciated his discretion, understanding that establishing herself as the ranch cook without complications was important for her position. That evening, as she prepared for bed in her small cabin, Beatrice reflected on the whirlwind changes of the past week. From humiliation on Silver Creek's main street to a respectable position at one of the territory's largest ranches, it seemed almost too much good fortune to believe. And Preston O'Malley, the handsome cowboy who had stepped into her life at exactly the right moment, offering not just immediate assistance, but a path to a better future. Beatrice wasn't naive enough to build castles in the air based on a few kind gestures and meaningful glances, but she couldn't deny the flutter in her chest whenever she thought of him. Sleep came easily again, and with it, dreams of possibilities she hadn't dared consider in the lonely months since her father's death. The following days established a rhythm to Beatrice's new life. She rose before dawn to prepare breakfast for the ranch hands, hearty fare of biscuits, gravy, eggs, and bacon that would fuel their morning work. Midday brought them back to the cookhouse, hungry and dusty, ready for stews, beans, cornbread, and whatever else Beatrice had prepared. Suppers were simpler but plentiful, often followed by fresh-baked pies or cobblers that earned her appreciation and respect from even the most taciturn hands. Preston was a constant presence, though never intrusive. He would thank her for meals with the others, but occasionally linger behind to exchange a few private words or help carry empty dishes back to the kitchen. These small interactions, brief as they were, became the highlights of Beatrice's days. 2 weeks into her new position, Preston appeared at the cookhouse door after the other hands had left following breakfast. Beatrice was kneading dough for the day's bread, flour dusting her apron and a few strands of hair that had escaped her practical bun. "Good morning," he said, leaning against the door frame. "Do you have a moment?" Beatrice smiled, continuing to work the dough. "I always have a moment for someone who appreciates my cooking as vocally as you do," Preston chuckled, stepping into the kitchen. "The appreciation is genuine, though I'm here on official business today." "Oh?" Beatrice raised an eyebrow, setting the dough aside to rise. "Matthew asked if I'd ride out to check on a herd in the south pasture. It's near your homestead." Preston hesitated. "I thought you might want to come along, check on your place. Mrs. Bradley already gave her permission for you to take a few hours, as long as you're back to prepare supper." The invitation was unexpected, but welcome. Beatrice had been so busy adjusting to her new role that she hadn't had time to think about her father's property, but now that Preston mentioned it, she felt a sudden longing to see the familiar cabin and garden. "I'd like that very much," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "When would we leave?" "As soon as you're ready," Preston replied. "I've saddled 2 horses. Mrs. Bradley suggested you might prefer your own mount to riding double again." The thoughtfulness of the gesture, both Preston's and Mrs. Bradley's, touched Beatrice deeply. "Give me 10 minutes to finish this dough and change into riding clothes." 20 minutes later, they were riding away from the ranch, Beatrice atop a gentle mare named Daisy that Mrs. Bradley sometimes used for short trips. The day was perfect for riding warm but not hot, with a light breeze carrying the scent of sage and sun-warmed earth. "You've settled in well," Preston observed as they rode side by side across the open rangeland. "The hands can't stop talking about your cooking." Beatrice smiled, pleased by the compliment. It's satisfying work. And the Bradleys have been very kind. They think highly of you already, Preston said. Matthew mentioned yesterday that hiring you was one of his wife's better decisions. High praise indeed, Beatrice laughed. And what about you, Preston? Are you settling in at the Bradley Ranch? He nodded, his expression thoughtful. I am. It's good to have steady work, to be in one place for a while. He glanced at her. To have reasons to stay. The implication behind his words warmed Beatrice more than the summer sun overhead. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts but acutely aware of the other's presence. As they approached Beatrice's homestead, she felt a curious mixture of emotions: nostalgia, relief that it still stood unchanged, and a surprising realization that it no longer felt quite like home. 2 weeks at the Bradley Ranch had shifted something fundamental in her perspective. The garden looks good, Preston remarked as they dismounted near the cabin, considering no one's been tending it. It was true. The vegetables were thriving, though weeds had begun to encroach around the edges. It gets good sunlight and the soil holds moisture well, Beatrice explained, already moving toward the garden to examine it more closely. My father chose the location carefully. Preston followed, watching as she checked the tomato plants and bean vines with practiced hands. He seems to have been a man who planned well. He was, Beatrice agreed softly. Practical, hard-working, but also kind. He would have liked you, I think. The simple statement seemed to affect Preston deeply. He stood a little straighter, his expression solemn. I would have been honored to meet him. They moved on to the cabin, which Beatrice unlocked with the key she still carried. Inside, all was as she had left it, clean, sparse, waiting. Yet it felt smaller somehow, as though her brief time in the wider world had expanded her vision beyond these familiar walls. Is there anything you need to take back with you? Preston asked, standing respectfully near the door while Beatrice moved through the small space. She considered, running her fingers along the edge of the table where her father had carved his initials years ago. No, I don't think so. I have everything I need at the ranch for now. When she turned back to Preston, she found him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. What is it? She asked. I was just thinking, he said slowly, about how brave you are, leaving the only home you've known, starting fresh among strangers. Beatrice shook her head. It's not bravery. It's necessity. And, she hesitated, and perhaps a desire for something more than just surviving alone. Preston took a step closer. What would that something more look like for you, Beatrice? The question hung in the air between them, fraught with possibilities. Beatrice found herself unable to look away from his earnest gaze. I'm not entirely sure, she admitted. Security, certainly, meaningful work, but also connection, not being alone anymore. Another step brought Preston close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes. I understand that desire very well. For a breathless moment, Beatrice thought he might kiss her. She wasn't sure if she wanted him to or not. Everything was happening so quickly, feelings developing that she hadn't anticipated when she accepted the position at the ranch. Instead, Preston gently took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. Beatrice, I don't want to rush you or presume anything, but I want you to know that my interest in you goes beyond friendship or concern for your welfare. The directness of his statement was both startling and refreshing. I feel the same, Beatrice replied softly, though it seems very sudden. Preston smiled, the expression lighting his entire face. Sometimes life changes direction in an instant, like when a cowboy sees a proud woman being mocked for something beyond her control and decides to step in. Or when that woman finds unexpected kindness in a place she least expected it, Beatrice added, returning his smile. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken promise, until Preston reluctantly released her hand and glanced toward the window. We should start back soon if you're to be back in time for supper preparations. Beatrice nodded, though part of her wished they could remain in this quiet cabin, in this perfect moment, a little longer. Yes, of course. Before they left, Preston helped her pull the most obvious weeds from the garden and check that the cabin was secure. The simple domestic tasks, performed together, felt significant somehow, a partnership, however brief, in caring for what had been her father's legacy. The ride back to the Bradley ranch was mostly silent, but it was a comfortable silence, filled with shared glances and small smiles. Something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing since their first meeting. As they approached the ranch, however, Preston's expression grew more serious. "Beatrice, I want to be clear about something." "Yes?" she asked, a thread of anxiety creeping into her voice. "I respect your position at the ranch, and I won't do anything to complicate it for you. The Bradleys run a respectable operation, and there are expectations about proper behavior." Beatrice understood immediately. "You're saying we should be discreet about whatever this is between us?" Preston nodded. "For now. Until we're both sure of what we want and how to proceed honorably." The consideration behind his words, putting her reputation and position first, only deepened Beatrice's growing feelings for him. "I appreciate that, Preston. Truly." As they rode into the ranch yard, they naturally put a proper distance between their horses, resuming the roles of ranch hand and cook rather than man and woman, with growing affection for each other. But the memory of their conversation in the cabin and the gentle touch of his hand on hers lingered like a promise. Over the next few weeks, Beatrice fell into a comfortable routine at the Bradley ranch. Her cooking won universal praise from the hands, and Mrs. Bradley increasingly trusted her with running the kitchen independently. She visited her father's homestead once a week, sometimes accompanied by Preston when his duties permitted, sometimes with one of the other hands assigned to escort her. Preston was careful to maintain a respectful distance in public, never singling her out for attention that might cause gossip. But there were moments, a lingering glance across the dining room, a brief touch of hands when passing a dish. Quiet conversations on the porch of her cabin after supper, when others had retired for the evening, that spoke of deepening feelings neither could deny. July brought scorching heat and the town's Independence Day celebration. The Bradleys, as prominent ranchers, were expected to attend, and to everyone's surprise, Mrs. Bradley insisted that Beatrice accompany them. "You've earned a day of leisure," she told Beatrice firmly, "and it's time the town saw you as part of the Bradley household, not just the girl they mocked on the street." The prospect of returning to Silver Creek filled Beatrice with trepidation, but also a certain determination. She was not the same woman who had been humiliated in her tattered dress months earlier. She had stable employment, a growing savings account, and a sense of belonging she hadn't felt since her father's death. And she had Preston, who would be attending the celebration as part of the Bradley Ranch contingent. The morning of the 4th dawned clear and hot. Beatrice dressed carefully in her best dress, a new one she'd made herself from fabric purchased with her first month's wages. The deep green cotton was simple but well cut, emphasizing her slender waist and bringing out the blue of her eyes. When she emerged from her cabin to join the Bradleys for the ride to town, she found Preston waiting beside the wagon, dressed in clean denims, a pressed shirt, and a new vest. His hat was pushed back on his head, and he was freshly shaved, his hair still damp from washing. "Miss Mills," he said formally, though his eyes conveyed much more than his words. "You look lovely." "Thank you, Mr. O'Malley," she replied with equal formality, accepting his hand to climb into the wagon. "You look quite handsome yourself." The touch of his hand lingered a moment longer than strictly necessary. A small liberty that sent warmth spreading through her despite the early morning coolness. The town was transformed for the celebration. Bunting draped the storefronts. A platform had been erected in the town square for speeches and musical performances, and tables laden with food lined one side of the street. Children darted through the growing crowd, waving small flags and setting off occasional firecrackers that made the horses snort nervously. As the Bradley wagon rolled down the main street, Beatrice felt the weight of stares. No doubt many remembered the scene months earlier when she had stood humiliated in her tattered dress. But now she sat tall beside Mrs. Bradley, no longer the object of pity or scorn, but a respected member of the territory's most prominent ranch household. They parked near the bank and dismounted, joining the throng of celebrants. Mr. Bradley was immediately pulled into conversation with other landowners, while Mrs. Bradley greeted the wives of town businessmen with practiced cordiality. The ranch hands, including Preston, were given liberty to enjoy the festivities, with instructions to reassemble at sunset for the journey home. "Miss Mills," a familiar voice called as Beatrice stood uncertainly at the edge of the gathering. She turned to find Vivian Thompson approaching, her silk dress rustling importantly as she walked. "Mrs. Thompson," Beatrice replied evenly, bracing herself for whatever cutting remark might follow. To her surprise, Vivian's expression held none of the disdain Beatrice remembered from their last encounter. "I understand congratulations are in order. Mrs. Bradley speaks very highly of your skills as a cook." The unexpected civility momentarily left Beatrice speechless. "Thank you," she managed finally. "The Bradleys have been very kind employers." "Indeed." Vivian glanced around, then lowered her voice conspiratorially. "I must confess, I was surprised when I heard you had taken the position. Managing on your own at your father's homestead must have been challenging." There was a note of genuine curiosity in Vivian's voice that Beatrice had never heard before. "It was," she acknowledged, "but the opportunity at the Bradley Ranch offered security I couldn't achieve alone." Vivian nodded, her expression thoughtful. "A practical decision. Many women in your position would have sought marriage as the only solution." The implication hung in the air between them that Beatrice had chosen independence and honest work, rather than trying to secure a husband out of desperation. It seemed Vivian Thompson was reassessing her previous judgment, viewing Beatrice's choices through a different lens. "The Independence Day Committee has organized dancing later this afternoon," Vivian continued, changing the subject. "I do hope you'll participate. Several eligible gentlemen from surrounding ranches are in attendance." Before Beatrice could respond, Preston appeared at her side. Nodding politely to Vivian. "Mrs. Thompson, Miss Mills, I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all, Mr. O'Malley," Vivian replied, her gaze moving speculatively between them. "I was just informing Miss Mills about the dancing planned for later today." "Is that so?" Preston's expression revealed nothing, but Beatrice could sense his tension. "I was actually hoping Miss Mills might join me for some lemonade. If you'll excuse us, Mrs. Thompson." Vivian inclined her head graciously. "Of course. Enjoy the celebration, both of you." As they walked away, Beatrice could feel Vivian's eyes following them, calculating and curious. "Was she being unpleasant?" Preston asked quietly once they were out of earshot. "Surprisingly, no," Beatrice replied. "Almost the opposite. I think being associated with the Bradleys has elevated my standing considerably in her eyes." Preston frowned. "People like Vivian Thompson judge others based on their usefulness or connection to power. Don't be fooled by her sudden civility." "I'm not," Beatrice assured him, "but I won't pretend it isn't a relief to walk through town without being mocked." Preston's expression softened as he handed her a cup of lemonade from a nearby stand. "You deserve their respect, Beatrice. You always did, regardless of your dress or position." The simple validation warmed her more than the summer sun beating down on the crowded street. "Thank you for seeing that when others didn't." They spent the morning wandering through the celebration, sampling food from the community tables, listening to patriotic speeches, though both agreed they were overly long-winded in the July heat, and watching children's games and contests. If anyone noticed that the Bradley ranch cook and one of their hands seemed particularly friendly, no comments were made within their hearing. As afternoon arrived, bringing marginally cooler temperatures, the promised dancing began. A small band of local musicians set up on the platform, and couples began to form sets for the first dance. "Would you do me the honor?" Preston asked formally, extending his hand to Beatrice. She hesitated, glancing around at the forming crowd. "Are you sure that's wise? People will talk." "Let them," Preston replied with a shrug. "It's a public celebration. One dance between acquaintances is hardly scandalous." Put that way, it seemed harmless enough. Beatrice placed her hand in his and allowed him to lead her into the set forming for a Virginia reel. The music began, lively and infectious, and soon Beatrice found herself swept up in the joy of the dance. Preston was a surprisingly good dancer, guiding her through the steps with confidence and grace that belied his cowboy appearance. When their hands touched during the figures of the dance, Beatrice felt a connection that went beyond the simple physical contact, a recognition, a belonging, a rightness she had never experienced before. As the dance ended, Preston kept hold of her hand a moment longer than necessary, his eyes conveying emotions too complex for public expression. "Another?" he asked as the musicians readied for the next set. Beatrice nodded. Breathless, not from exertion, but from the intensity of his gaze. "Yes, please." One dance became two, then three, until Beatrice lost count. They separated occasionally. Propriety demanded that they dance with others, but always found their way back to each other as new sets formed. During a break in the music, as Preston fetched water for both of them, Beatrice became aware of curious glances and whispered conversations directed their way. Mrs. Bradley appeared at her side, her expression unreadable. "You seem to be enjoying the celebration, Miss Mills," she observed mildly. "Very much, Mrs. Bradley," Beatrice replied, suddenly anxious that she had somehow overstepped. "I hope my dancing with Preston with Mr. O'Malley isn't inappropriate." Mrs. Bradley's expression softened slightly. "It's a public celebration, my dear. Dancing is expected." She paused, then added more quietly, "Though one might note the frequency with which you two have partnered each other." Beatrice felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the summer temperature. "I apologize if—" "No apologies necessary," Mrs. Bradley interrupted gently. "I merely suggest awareness of appearances. You've worked hard to establish yourself at the ranch. It would be a shame to complicate that position." The gentle warning was clear, not a prohibition, but a caution. "I understand," Beatrice said quietly. "Thank you for your concern." Mrs. Bradley nodded, patting Beatrice's arm maternally before moving away to rejoin her husband. When Preston returned with their water, Beatrice accepted it gratefully, but declined his invitation to join the next dance. "Mrs. Bradley?" he guessed, his expression falling slightly. "She was kind about it," Beatrice assured him. "But yes, she suggested we be more mindful of appearances." Preston nodded, his disappointment evident but understanding. "She's right. I've been selfish, wanting to keep you to myself today." "I've enjoyed every minute," Beatrice admitted softly, "but perhaps we should be more circumspect for the remainder of the celebration." They spent the rest of the afternoon maintaining a proper distance, joining different groups, participating in separate activities. But Beatrice was acutely aware of Preston's presence wherever he was, his gaze finding hers across the crowded square, a silent communication that needed no words. As the sun began to set, the Bradley party reassembled for the journey back to the ranch. Beatrice found herself in the wagon again, this time seated beside Mrs. Bradley while Mr. Bradley drove. Preston rode alongside with the other hands, maintaining the proper distance between ranch cook and cowboy. "Did you enjoy your first Silver Creek Independence Day, Miss Mills?" Mrs. Bradley asked as the wagon rolled out of town. "Very much," Beatrice replied truthfully. "It was kind of you to insist I attend." Mrs. Bradley nodded, her gaze thoughtful as she observed the younger woman. "You know, when Matthew and I first came to this territory, we had nothing but each other and a dream of building something lasting. People said a woman couldn't survive the frontier. That I should have stayed back east while my husband established our ranch." Beatrice listened, curious about the direction of this unexpected confidence. "But Matthew insisted we face the challenges together," Mrs. Bradley continued. "He said a partnership was stronger than a man alone, even on the frontier. Perhaps especially on the frontier." She paused, her gaze drifting to where her husband sat handling the reins. 20 years later, I believe he was right. Understanding dawned slowly. Mrs. Bradley wasn't warning Beatrice away from Preston. She was cautioning them to be thoughtful about how they proceeded. Mrs. Bradley, Beatrice began carefully, I want you to know that I value my position at your ranch above all else. I would never do anything to jeopardize that or to bring disrepute to your household. I know that, my dear, Mrs. Bradley replied gently. And I also know that a woman alone in this territory faces challenges that can break the strongest spirit. If you find someone who sees your worth and treats you with respect, that's not something to disregard lightly. She smiled slightly. Even if that someone happens to be one of our ranch hands. The tacit blessing, for that's what it seemed to be, left Beatrice momentarily speechless. Thank you, she managed finally, for your understanding and your kindness. Just promise me one thing, Mrs. Bradley said, her tone turning practical again. Whatever develops between you and Preston, don't let it happen in a way that forces Matthew to lose a good ranch hand and me to lose an excellent cook. I've finally got the kitchen running properly again. The unexpected humor broke the tension, and Beatrice laughed softly. I promise. As the wagon rolled on toward the ranch, Beatrice glanced back to where Preston rode with the other hands. He caught her eye and smiled, a private moment in the gathering dusk that felt like the beginning of something significant. The weeks following the Independence Day celebration brought subtle changes to Beatrice's relationship with Preston. Mrs. Bradley's tacit approval, while encouraging discretion, had removed the fear of discovery or disapproval that had constrained them both. They still maintained proper behavior in public, but Preston now regularly escorted Beatrice on her weekly visits to her homestead, and their evening conversations on her cabin porch grew longer and more personal. August brought scorching heat that left the ranch hands exhausted and Beatrice working in a kitchen that felt like the inside of a stove. Still, there was satisfaction in providing hearty meals that sustained the men through their grueling work, and pride in seeing her savings grow with each month's wages. One sweltering afternoon, as Beatrice kneaded dough for the next day's bread, Preston appeared at the kitchen door, his shirt soaked with sweat and dust covering his denims. "Aren't you supposed to be helping with the fence repair in the north pasture?" Beatrice asked, surprised to see him midday. "I was," Preston replied, removing his hat and wiping his brow with his sleeve. "But Matthew got word that there's a problem at your homestead. Something about trespassers. He asked if I'd ride out to check." Beatrice's hands stilled in the dough. "Trespassers? Who brought the message?" "Harper, your neighbor. He rode in about an hour ago, said he'd seen strangers around your cabin yesterday. Matthew told him I'd go investigate." Concern flooded through Beatrice. Her father's homestead wasn't much, but it was all she had of him, all she owned outright in the world. "I'm coming with you," Preston nodded, having clearly anticipated her response. "Mrs. Bradley already said you should go. I've saddled Daisy for you." 15 minutes later, they were riding hard toward Beatrice's property, the summer sun beating down mercilessly on their heads. Preston had brought his rifle, cleaned and loaded, secured in the saddle holster. As they approached the homestead, Beatrice's heart sank. Even from a distance, she could see that something was wrong. The cabin door stood open, swinging slightly in the breeze. Preston held up a hand, signaling for her to stop. "Wait here," he said quietly, drawing his rifle. "Let me check first." Beatrice nodded, too anxious to argue. She watched as Preston approached the cabin cautiously, rifle at the ready, his movements betraying years of frontier experience. He disappeared inside the small structure, and the seconds stretched like hours until he emerged again, his expression grim. "It's clear," he called, but they made a mess of things. Beatrice dismounted quickly, hurrying toward the cabin with dread pooling in her stomach. Inside, the devastation was immediately apparent. The few pieces of furniture had been overturned. Her father's trunk pried open, the contents strewn across the floor. The mattress had been slashed, straw stuffing scattered everywhere. "Oh no," she whispered, kneeling to gather a handful of papers. Her father's documents, letters from her mother that she had kept carefully preserved. "Why would anyone do this?" Preston stood in the doorway, his expression hard. "Looking for valuables, most likely. Drifters, probably. Harper said the territory has seen an increase in desperate men passing through." Beatrice moved through the small cabin, cataloging the damage with growing distress. My mother's hairbrush is gone. And the silver frame with her picture. Small items, but irreplaceable, the few tangible connections she had to the mother she'd never known. I'm so sorry, Beatrice, Preston said gently, moving to her side. We should check the rest of the property, see if there's any other damage. Outside, they found the garden trampled in places, though whether by the intruders or by wildlife attracted to the vegetables was unclear. The small tool shed had been broken into, and her father's axe and shovel were missing. Practical items they could sell or use, Preston observed grimly. This wasn't random vandalism. They took things of value and left the rest. Beatrice nodded numbly, the reality of the violation settling over her like a heavy blanket. This place that had been her sanctuary, her history, her connection to her parents, had been desecrated by strangers with no regard for what it meant to her. What do I do now? She asked, her voice small in the vast landscape. Preston's arm came around her shoulders, solid and comforting. First, we clean up what we can. Then we secure the place better. And then, he added, his voice hardening, I talked to Matthew about sending some men to patrol the area. If these drifters are still nearby, they need to know that stealing from honest folks has consequences. The practicality of his approach gave Beatrice something to focus on beyond her shock and grief. Together, they set about restoring order to the cabin, righting furniture, gathering scattered papers, sweeping up the worst of the debris. Preston fixed the broken latch on the door as best he could with the limited tools they had, and fashioned a more secure lock from a piece of wood and some cord. It's temporary, he explained, but better than nothing until we can bring proper supplies. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, they had done all they could for the moment. The cabin was tidier, though the slashed mattress would need replacing, and the missing items were gone beyond recovery. They sat together on the porch steps, exhausted and dirty from their efforts. Beatrice leaned against Preston's shoulder, taking comfort in his solid presence. Thank you, she said quietly. I couldn't have faced this alone. Preston's arm tightened around her. You don't have to face anything alone anymore, Beatrice. Not if you don't want to. The simple declaration hung in the air between them, laden with meaning beyond the immediate situation. Beatrice turned to look at him, finding his gaze intent upon her face. What are you saying, Preston? He took a deep breath, as though gathering courage. I'm saying that I care for you. Deeply. More than I expected to when I first saw you in town that day. He paused, searching her face. And I think I hope that you might feel the same. Beatrice's heart quickened. I do, she admitted softly. But you're worried about your position at the ranch, about what people might say. Preston's understanding of her concerns only deepened her feelings for him. Yes, she acknowledged, and about moving too quickly. We've known each other such a short time. Preston nodded, his expression serious. I understand. I don't want to rush you, Beatrice, but today, seeing what happened here, he gestured toward the cabin. It reminded me how quickly things can change, how important it is to speak honestly about what matters. Beatrice couldn't argue with that truth. The violation of her homestead had shaken her deeply, reminding her of the precariousness of life on the frontier. What matters to me, Preston continued, taking her hand gently in his, is you. Your happiness, your security, your future. I want to be part of that future, if you'll have me. The directness of his declaration took her breath away. Is this a proposal, Preston O'Malley? A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Not yet, not quite. I respect you too much to propose when you're in shock over what's happened here. His thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand. But consider it notice of my intentions. When the time is right, when you're ready, I hope to make it official. The mix of emotions that swept through Beatrice was overwhelming joy at his declaration, lingering distress over the break-in, and a powerful sense that her life was changing direction once again. This time, toward something bright and hopeful. I don't know what to say, she admitted. You don't need to say anything now, Preston assured her. Just know that whatever happens, whatever you decide, I'm here. You're not alone. As the setting sun painted the landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Beatrice leaned her head against Preston's shoulder once more, finding solace in his steadfast presence. The day had brought destruction and loss, but also clarity and the promise of something new, something built on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than necessity or convenience. They rode back to the Bradley ranch in the gathering dusk, the events of the day cementing a bond between them that transcended their relatively brief acquaintance. Whatever the future held, Beatrice knew with certainty that she no longer faced it alone. Word of the break-in at Beatrice's homestead spread quickly through the Bradley ranch. Matthew Bradley, concerned both for his employees' property and the security of the surrounding area, dispatched several hands to patrol the region and instructed Preston to help Beatrice make more permanent repairs to the cabin. "Take whatever supplies you need from the ranch stores," he told them. "And Beatrice, you're welcome to stay at the ranch as long as you need to. Your position and cabin here are secure." The generosity of the offer reinforced Beatrice's gratitude for the stability her employment provided. While her father's homestead represented her past and her heritage, the Bradley Ranch had become her present, and increasingly, it seemed, might be part of her future. Over the next few weeks, Preston spent his free days helping Beatrice restore her cabin. They replaced the broken door with a sturdier one, installed proper locks, and repaired the slashed mattress as best they could. The work provided natural opportunities for them to be alone together, furthering a relationship that grew deeper with each conversation, each shared task, each quiet moment of connection. September brought cooler temperatures and changing rhythms to the ranch. The most intensive summer work was done, and the hands had more time for leisure in the evenings. Mrs. Bradley, noting the obvious attachment between Beatrice and Preston, tactfully arranged for them to have compatible time off, allowing their courtship to progress without compromising either's responsibilities. One crisp autumn evening, as golden light bathed the ranch buildings, Preston appeared at the cookhouse door just as Beatrice was finishing the supper dishes. "Get your shawl," he said with a mysterious smile. "I want to show you something." Intrigued, Beatrice dried her hands and reached for the woolen shawl she kept on a peg by the door. "What is it?" "You'll see," Preston replied, offering his arm with a formality that made her smile. He led her away from the main buildings, following a path that wound up a gentle rise overlooking the ranch. At the top stood a massive old oak tree, its leaves beginning to turn from green to russet and gold. Beneath it, to Beatrice's surprise, was a blanket spread on the ground and a small basket. "What's all this?" she asked, delighted by the unexpected gesture. "A picnic," Preston explained, guiding her to the blanket. "Mrs. Bradley helped with the food. I thought you deserved an evening where someone else did the cooking for a change." Touched by his thoughtfulness, Beatrice settled onto the blanket while Preston unpacked the basket, cold chicken, fresh bread, early apples from the ranch orchard, and a small jar of honey. "This is wonderful," she said as they began to eat, "though I feel I should be critiquing Mrs. Bradley's cooking, given how often she tastes mine." Preston laughed, the sound warm in the evening air. "I won't tell her if you don't." They ate companionably as the sun began its descent toward the distant mountains, casting long shadows across the ranch below. From their vantage point, they could see the entire operation, the main house, the bunkhouse, the barns and corrals, even Beatrice's small cook's cabin. Beyond the immediate buildings stretched pastures where cattle grazed, the landscape rolling toward the horizon in endless waves of grass. "It's beautiful up here," Beatrice observed, wrapping her shawl more tightly around her shoulders as the evening cooled. "I found it my first week at the ranch," Preston said. "I come up here sometimes to think, to remind myself how far I've come from that tornado-ravaged farm in Nebraska." Beatrice studied his profile, strong and sure against the deepening twilight. "Do you ever miss it? Your home there?" Preston considered the question. "I miss what it represented: family, belonging, roots. But the place itself?" He shook his head. "After it was destroyed, there wasn't much to miss, just memories." "I understand that," Beatrice said softly, thinking of her own cabin. Even after their repairs, it wasn't the same. The violation of the break-in had changed her relationship to the place, making it feel less like a sanctuary and more like a responsibility, a connection to the past that required maintenance, but no longer felt quite like home. They fell silent, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening eastern sky. Preston shifted closer on the blanket, his arm coming around Beatrice's shoulders in a gesture that had become familiar and welcome over the past weeks. "Beatrice," he said, his voice low and serious, "there's something I want to ask you." Her heart quickened at his tone. "Yes?" Preston turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "These past months have been the happiest of my life. Meeting you, getting to know you, watching your courage and determination in the face of challenges, it's made me certain of what I want for my future." Beatrice could hardly breathe as he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object. "I meant what I said at your cabin that day," Preston continued, "that I wanted to be part of your future. I still do more than ever." He opened his palm to reveal a simple gold ring with a small, perfect pearl set in its center. "Beatrice Mills, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Though she had anticipated this moment might come, the reality of it, the earnestness in Preston's eyes, the simple beauty of the ring, the depth of feeling evident in his voice overwhelmed her. "Preston," she whispered, tears gathering in her eyes, "are you certain? We've known each other such a short time." "I've never been more certain of anything," he replied without hesitation. "I know it hasn't been long in terms of months and days, but in all the ways that matter in understanding each other, in shared values, in feeling like I've found the person I was meant to find, it feels like I've known you all my life." The sentiment echoed Beatrice's own feelings so perfectly that a tear slipped down her cheek. "I feel the same," she admitted, "like you were the piece that was missing that makes everything else make sense." Preston's expression softened, hope lighting his eyes. "Is that a yes, Beatrice Mills?" She nodded, joy bubbling up through her tears. "Yes, Preston O'Malley. Yes, I will marry you." With gentle hands, Preston slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, the pearl catching the last light of day in a soft glow. "It was my mother's," he explained, "the only thing I managed to salvage from our farm after the tornado. I've carried it with me all these years, waiting for the right person to give it to." The significance of the gift, this one precious connection to his past entrusted to her, moved Beatrice deeply. "I'll treasure it always," she promised, her fingers curling around his. Under the spreading oak tree, with stars beginning to pepper the darkening sky, Preston drew her close and kissed her for the first time. It was gentle but certain, a seal on their promises and a glimpse of the partnership they were choosing to build together. When they finally returned to the ranch, hand in hand and glowing with their new understanding, Mrs. Bradley was waiting on the porch of the main house. One look at their faces told her everything she needed to know. "Well," she said with a satisfied smile, "it seems congratulations are in order." Word of their engagement spread quickly through the ranch, met with genuine congratulations from the hands who had come to respect both Beatrice's cooking and Preston's work ethic. Matthew Bradley shook Preston's hand firmly and assured him that married quarters could be arranged on the ranch property. "No need for you two to start from scratch elsewhere," he said practically. "Good help is hard to find in this territory. We'd be fools to let either of you go." The offer was generous and solved the immediate question of where they would live after marriage. Beatrice's cook's cabin was too small for a couple, and while Preston had been saving diligently, building a new home would take time and resources. "What about my father's homestead?" Beatrice asked Preston that evening as they sat on her cabin porch, making plans for their future. Preston considered the question thoughtfully. "We could maintain it, visit when we can. Maybe someday. If we wanted to farm rather than ranch, we could build it up properly." He squeezed her hand. "It's your decision, Beatrice. It's your family land." The fact that he placed the choice in her hands, respecting her connection to her heritage, only confirmed for Beatrice that she had chosen well. "I think I'd like to keep it," she decided. "As you said, it represents possibilities for the future. But for now, staying here at the ranch makes the most sense. With practical matters settled, they turned to planning the wedding itself. Neither wanted to wait long, and both preferred simplicity to elaborate celebration. "The church in Silver Creek," Preston suggested, "with a small gathering afterward?" Beatrice nodded, though the thought of returning to the town where she had once been mocked brought a flicker of anxiety. "Will people think it's too sudden?" Preston smiled, touching the pearl ring on her finger. "Let them think what they will. We know what we've found in each other." The wedding was set for the first Saturday in October, just 3 weeks away. Mrs. Bradley immediately took charge of preparations, insisting that Beatrice have a proper dress and that the celebration following the ceremony be held at the ranch. "You're part of our household," she told Beatrice firmly. "This is our privilege and pleasure." The days leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of activity. Beatrice continued her cooking duties while also working on her wedding dress in the evenings, a simple but elegant creation of ivory cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs, far removed from the tattered dress she had worn on the day she first met Preston. Preston, meanwhile, made arrangements with the minister in Silver Creek and worked with the ranch carpenter to prepare their future home, a small but sturdy cabin being built near the main house, more spacious than Beatrice's cook's cabin, but still modest and practical. 2 days before the wedding, as Beatrice was putting the finishing touches on her dress, Mrs. Bradley appeared at her cabin door with a small package. "A wedding gift," she explained, handing it to Beatrice, "from Matthew and me." Curious, Beatrice unwrapped the paper to find a deed inside the deed to her father's homestead, amended to include both her name and Preston's. "We had it properly registered in town," Mrs. Bradley explained, "so there can never be any question about ownership, especially with the recent trouble there." Beatrice stared at the document, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Mrs. Bradley waved away her thanks. "You've brought order to my kitchen and happiness to one of our best hands. That's thanks enough," she smiled, a rare softening of her practical demeanor. "Besides, every couple should have something that belongs entirely to them, a foundation for their future together." The morning of the wedding dawned clear and cool, the October air crisp with the promise of autumn. Beatrice dressed in her new gown, her hair arranged simply with small white flowers tucked into the coiled braids. Mrs. Bradley had lent her a pair of pearl earrings that complemented her engagement ring, the only jewelry she wore. The Bradley ranch hands had polished the wagon to a shine for the journey to town, and Mr. Bradley himself drove Beatrice and Mrs. Bradley to the small church in Silver Creek. Preston had gone ahead with the other hands, as tradition dictated the groom should not see the bride before the ceremony. As the wagon rolled down the main street of Silver Creek, Beatrice was struck by how different her feelings were from the last time she had entered this town in shame and humiliation. Now she sat tall beside Mrs. Bradley, her new dress a symbol not just of improved circumstances, but of the journey that had brought her to this day. People stopped to watch the wagon pass, many nodding respectfully to the Bradleys and offering small smiles to Beatrice. News of the wedding had spread through the small community, and while there might be gossip about the speed of the courtship, there was also a frontier pragmatism that recognized the value of finding a good partner in a territory where life was challenging and often short. The church was small but lovely, decorated with autumn flowers and lit by sunshine streaming through simple windows. As Beatrice entered on Mr. Bradley's arm, he had offered to give her away in her father's absence, she saw Preston waiting at the altar, his expression transforming from nervous anticipation to pure joy as he caught sight of her. He looked handsome, in a new suit purchased for the occasion, his normally unruly hair neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. But it was the look in his eyes, a mixture of love, pride, and absolute certainty that brought tears to Beatrice's eyes as she walked toward him. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful, the minister's words emphasizing the partnership and commitment they were undertaking. When Preston slipped a simple gold band onto Beatrice's finger to join her pearl engagement ring, his hands were steady, his voice clear as he repeated his vows. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared, and Preston's kiss was both tender and certain, a promise of the life they would build together. Outside the church, they were met with congratulations and well wishes from the ranch hands, the Bradleys, and even some townspeople who had attended the service. To Beatrice's surprise, Vivian Thompson approached, offering her hand with what appeared to be genuine goodwill. "Congratulations, Mrs. O'Malley," she said, the new name sending a thrill through Beatrice. "You make a lovely bride." "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson," Beatrice replied, accepting the olive branch for what it was. As they prepared to return to the ranch for the celebration, Preston helped Beatrice into the wagon, then paused, reaching into his pocket. "I have something for you," he said softly, for her ears alone. "A wedding gift." Beatrice watched curiously as he withdrew a small velvet pouch and placed it in her hands. Inside, she found a delicate silver frame and a familiar hairbrush with copper-brown strands still caught in the bristles. "My mother's things," she gasped, looking up at him in astonishment. "But how? They were stolen." Preston smiled, clearly pleased by her reaction. "Matthew and I asked around, found the men who broke into your cabin working at a ranch near the territorial border. They were persuaded to return what they'd taken." Tears filled Beatrice's eyes as she clutched the recovered treasures. "Preston, I can't believe you did this. Thank you." "I wanted our wedding day to be perfect," he said simply, helping her secure the precious items in her reticule. "And I wanted you to have these connections to your past as we start our future." The journey back to the Bradley Ranch was filled with laughter and conversation, the wagon now carrying not just Beatrice and the Bradleys, but Preston as well, his hand firmly holding hers as they began their married life together. The celebration at the ranch was everything Beatrice could have wished for, simple but joyful, with plenty of food, prepared by the hands under Mrs. Bradley's direction, giving Beatrice a rare day off from cooking. Music from a fiddle played by one of the ranch hands, and dancing that continued well into the evening. As twilight fell, Preston led Beatrice away from the festivities toward their new cabin. It was small but solidly built, with 2 rooms instead of 1, proper windows with glass panes, and a stone hearth that would keep them warm through the coming winter. Inside, Beatrice found their few possessions already arranged: her trunk at the foot of the bed, Preston's saddle and gear neatly stowed, a rocking chair by the hearth that she recognized from the Bradleys' own home, given as a wedding gift. "What do you think?" Preston asked, watching her take in their new home. "It's not grand, but—" "It's perfect," Beatrice interrupted, turning to face him. "Absolutely perfect." In the gathering darkness, with only the light of a single lamp illuminating their new home, Preston drew his wife into his arms. "I never thought, when I rode into Silver Creek that day and saw you being mocked for your dress, that I'd find everything I ever wanted." Beatrice smiled up at him, her heart full to bursting with love and gratitude. "And I never imagined that the cowboy who rescued me would end up giving me not just a new dress, but a new life." "Not a new life," Preston corrected gently. "Your own life, but shared now. With me." As he bent to kiss her, Beatrice knew with absolute certainty that she had found her place in the world, not in a specific location or position, but in the partnership they were building together, a foundation stronger than any cabin or homestead could provide. Outside, the stars emerged one by one in the vast western sky, witnesses to new beginnings and the enduring power of respect, kindness, and love to transform lives on the wild frontier. 5 years later, Beatrice stood on the porch of the cabin she shared with Preston, watching as he taught their 3-year-old son, John, to ride his first pony. The boy's delighted laughter carried across the ranch yard, mingling with the everyday sounds of cattle, horses, and men at work. So much had changed since that fateful day in Silver Creek when a tattered dress had brought humiliation and, unexpectedly, the love of her life. Beatrice and Preston still worked for the Bradley Ranch, she as cook, he now as foreman after Matthew Bradley's right-hand man had retired the previous year. Their cabin had expanded with the addition of a small room for John and, God willing, the new baby that would arrive in the winter. Beatrice's hand rested on her still flat stomach, a secret she and Preston were keeping just a little longer. In the afternoon sun, Her pearl engagement ring and simple wedding band caught the light, reminders of promises made and kept through both joy and hardship. They still maintained her father's homestead, visiting regularly to tend the garden that now produced vegetables for both their table and the ranch kitchen. Preston had rebuilt the cabin, making it stronger and more secure, with plans to expand it further as their family grew. It served as both a connection to Beatrice's past and a hope for their children's future, a place where family history and new memories could intertwine. Silver Creek had grown as well, the railroad now passing close enough to bring regular commerce and new settlers. Vivian Thompson, surprisingly, had become, if not a friend, then at least a cordial acquaintance, her initial disdain transformed by time and Beatrice's evident happiness into something like respect. "Mama, look," John called, sitting proudly atop his pony as Preston led the gentle creature in a circle. "I'm riding like Papa." "I see you, sweetheart," Beatrice called back, her heart swelling with love for her small family. "You're doing wonderfully." Preston looked up, catching her eye with a smile that still made her pulse quicken after 5 years of marriage. In that smile was everything they had built together: trust, partnership, love that had only deepened with time and shared experiences. As the sun began its descent toward the distant mountains, painting the landscape in gold and crimson just as it had on the evening Preston proposed, Beatrice offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the tattered dress that had brought humiliation but led to unexpected joy, for the cowboy who had seen beyond appearances to the person she truly was, for the ring he had offered instead of judgment, and the life they had created together. In the wild and unpredictable territory where they had made their home, Beatrice had found something precious beyond measure, not just security or position or even love, but a true partnership of equals, building something lasting in a land where nothing was guaranteed. And as Preston lifted their son from the pony and carried him toward the porch, both of them laughing in the golden afternoon light, Beatrice knew with absolute certainty that she had found the most valuable treasure the frontier could offer: a place to belong, a family to love, and a future limited only by the vastness of the western sky above them.